core values to valued culture. Here is your host, Will Scott, interviewing another CEO about leading culture in their company.
So today we have Patricia Miller, CEO of Matrix 4 from Woodstock, Illinois. And start by telling us about your business, Patricia.
Sure. Matrix 4 is a design and manufacturing house, and we use the medium of plastic. So we make anything in plastic across the range, mostly in the consumer spaces, but for appliance, cosmetic, medical device, automotive, and do things from back of the napkin, ideation and sketch to full-scale manufacturing. Cool.
And how did you come to be CEO of Matrix 4?
My grandpa was the owner of the business for 37 years, and he was planning to close it in 2014, and I decided I was at a point in my career and ready to leave Fortune 500 and decided to take it over.
Wow, that's cool. And look, I just got to ask, because everyone's going to wonder, tell us about this fabulous chair you're sitting in.
Well, probably my passion is definitely design across any of the aspects, but I love interior design. So I'm sitting in my dining room right now, and this is a chair that I bought for my dining room table.
This sort of looks like an Alice in Wonderland chair.
That was the goal, as you know, for the dining room to be slightly Alice in Wonderland-esque.
Very cool. Okay, so getting started with the sort of culture side of things, what do you think of when one talks about corporate culture? What does that bring up for you?
Gosh, I think it's definitely become more of a buzzword more recently, but when I think about how we define corporate culture, I'm thinking of it more as transcendent. And definitely has some implicit and explicit parameters to it. But I think it's more of a frame of reference for us in terms of how we behave, how we conduct ourselves, what kind of energy is in our space, what the space consists of, and really becomes kind of the DNA of Matrix 4.
Very cool. So you call it the DNA of Matrix 4. By the way, did you notice the t-shirt I'm wearing?
I do. I appreciate it. Thank you for wearing that.
Well, thank you. It's one of my favorite t-shirts. And how would you describe the culture in your company?
I think it's definitely as much thoughtful as it is organic. And, we're 4 years into a restart. And so it was as much about transitioning a really traditional culture into something that was much more adherent to our current strategy and where we want to drive the business. But if I think about us overall, I think we're gritty and sophisticated at the same time. We're a flat organization, so we're definitely collaborative and provide a lot of input. I think raw and honest and authentic really go into our culture as well. And then I think creative and flexible.
Okay. And I'm not sure if those are part of your, let's go on to, you're sort of starting to define your corporate culture there. Have you defined it using corporate values or cultural values?
Yeah, I don't think we define culture by core values, but we definitely believe that core values are a part of culture.
And what are some of those core values?
So we have 3 core values. People first, make meaningfully, and communicate purposefully.
What process did you use to arrive at these core values?
Gosh, a very organic process. So maybe 6 months into the business, we were still a really small team, and we were doing one of our offsites, and my girlfriend Christine Lemke was facilitating, and we decided that we wanted to figure out what did we want to stand for as an organization, and what did we want to stand for internally. And so we did a brainstorm around what was important to us being in manufacturing and being able to build a manufacturing company. And so kind of just did a really large whiteboard exercise on what are all the verbs and adjectives that describe what we were doing at M4 and what we wanted to be defined as. And then we were able to bubble up all of that into the 3 core values that we have today. And then underneath each of those core values, obviously, there's a little bit more description.
Yeah, I definitely recommend that to my clients. I think it's so important. I mean, the core values, the actual words that you use are, of course, great. But then you need to say, what do they mean to us in Matrix 4? You can't just have a word like integrity, which is so broad, without having some description underneath it about what does it mean in your company. So you did go ahead and add what I sometimes call descriptive behaviors underneath each of your core values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Definitely.
What's an example of one that supports, for example, make meaningfully or communicate purposefully? What would be?
Sure. So make meaningfully is definitely one that we've really transcended beyond just a core value, but we believe it's, how we're making overall. And we didn't want to just make widgets. It was really important for me to look at how we were just defining a manufacturing company creatively and outside the box and challenging the status quo. And so it's not just that we're making widgets every day, but we want to make meaningfully things that matter. And so underneath make meaningfully, we have things like, hustle and heart, courage, failure is a part of it, enjoy the ride, because we definitely knew we were going to be making not just parts and products, but brands and this brand in business, Matrix 4.
Very cool. How aware are your employees of these core values?
I think they're super aware. I think it's always a challenge, though, as we've scaled and continue to add on teammates, that how do you make sure that that is something that's ingrained across the organization? And so we try to do things all the way from at every workstation on the floor, making sure our 3 core values are there along with our internal branding, and making sure it's in our conference rooms, making sure it's on our walls. And we even, as we looked at what our proven process was, as you know, when we were looking at the EOS implementation across that, we were able to bubble up our proven process to those 3 core values too.
Yeah, perhaps it's worth mentioning that, of course, you're a valued client of Culture Czars, and you defined your core values before I started working with you, but together we kind of grew those a little bit and took them forward into like a proven process that brought those things together, which would be a really nice infographic to share with the Culture Czar community.
Yeah.
So if you had to pick a number, what percentage do you think of your employees, let's say the office-based employees, because that's a little easier than perhaps some of the factory-based employees, but how many of them could actually recite those 3 core values that you have on the office side?
100%.
That's awesome. Yeah. Okay. And what about on the factory side?
I would say probably, 70% would be able to communicate, in verbatim what they are, but 100% know where to find them.
Okay. And as the leader of Matrix 4, how important is it to you to be deliberate about defining and managing your culture versus kind of letting it just grow by default and define itself?
I think it's critically important, I think my job as a CEO and is in my job description and as part of my lead manage accountable is, setting and driving the strategy and also being the champion of our culture. And so I do think that even if you had an N of 1 company and I was the only one working there, I would still be defining and driving a culture, just specific to me. And so I do believe that just continues to perpetuate itself as you get more employees. It needs to be something that's in the fiber of who we are.
Okay. And of course, as a CEO, there's a lot of things that you have to pay attention to and make priorities. Managing cash, sales, customer satisfaction, productivity. If you had to sort of say, where's culture amongst those priorities for you?
Well, it's in my top 3 priorities, as I said, from my job description in my LMA. So I know, it seemed there was a really good article Harvard Business Review did probably 10 years ago when I was still at Lilly, which really flipped the model on its head. Instead of focusing on profit, looking at how do you engage a team and how do you drive a culture. And there's a suggestion, I think it's proven for a lot of companies now, that if you engage your teammates and you drive a culture, people are going to be more engaged. It's going to drive productivity. Clients are going to be happier. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you're driving revenue and profit. So I don't really detach sales and strategy and clients from culture, because to me, it's that holistic mentality that it's all driving together.
Okay, great. That's absolutely the message that I like to spread as well. You talked earlier about what you've done to sort of make the values come alive and keep them thriving, so that people actually are aware of them. So you said, for example, you've got little cards at every workstation. I know you have posters on the wall and stuff. Anything else that you do to sort of make sure that people are aware of them and using them every day and every week?
Yeah, I think, hiring, firing, retaining, developing, and rewarding based on culture and core values is really important as well. And so when we do our mid-year and end-of-year reviews, our core values are on there, and we're rating our teammates based on, how well aligned they are to our as a culture fit, and then specifically to our core values. And definitely when we're celebrating wins or successes, we always try to link it back to our core values, and definitely was something that you helped us drive more towards. And I think, we also, I know there's a point of view 2 ways on this, that core values are something, internal to an organization, but because we've linked it to our proven process, and because we want to be driving a transparent, authentic company, we also communicate it to our clients as well, and challenge that, if they don't feel like we're making meaningfully or communicating purposely or putting people first, that they can challenge us on it, or call us out. Or as we're engaging in dialogue, we say, look, it's really important for us to have conflict for good or engage in debate. And so we've definitely tried to make it part of our language and part of how we do business every day.
That's very cool and very well said. So you're a great example of a CEO who's not just leading a company, but it's really leading a culture. And that, of course, is extending, as you just said, extends downstream to your customers and maybe upstream to your vendors and your suppliers. And I always say that helps make difficult conversations a lot easier when you're able to bring your culture to play in those conversations, not just within your company, but without your company too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think having come from a Fortune 500 background, like when I was with Eli Lilly, that's a culture that's been ingrained now 135 years and doesn't really move quickly, right? It's now in the fibers of their threads. And so for me, it was really great to be able to say, okay, yes, we do have this traditional historical business that we need to convert, and there are cultural things that we need to change, but let's put the stake in the ground to do it, because if we don't, then the workplace that I wanted to design and I wanted to work in wouldn't be consistent.
Yeah. So as soon as you mentioned that, I mean, perhaps what are some of the differences with trying to manage a culture in an old, established, large company like Eli Lilly versus a company like Matrix that has about 50 employees?
Yeah, well, when I started at Matrix, there were 6 or 7 of us. And so I think when you're scaling, even in a small organization, how do you make sure those things remain consistent? And there's definitely pros and cons of both. I think when you're in an established, well-defined organization that has a very inherent culture, you figure out very quickly if you fit or you don't fit into it. And I think if you don't fit into it, the idea of being able to change it is possible as long as you have leadership and a lot of people on board, but it's not as easy as being able to build it. And so, I'm a huge fan of being a change agent, and I think that's something you can be a catalyst or change agent at any level, but I think it's a lot harder to shape a culture that's already existent to be able to build one from scratch. And I think, being a single CEO and the only owner of Matrix 4 made it easier for me to define and design what we wanted this company to look like strategically in culture and DNA, versus when you're in an organization that is very well established with 40,000 employees. Being able to shift that requires a lot more energy and effort. But that's not to suggest that when I came into Matrix 4, it definitely wasn't something that I had to put thought and effort into, because Matrix had been around for 37 years. And the culture and mindset and strategy that was existing there for those years was not consistent or aligned with where I wanted to drive Matrix. And so we did have to take a very proactive approach to start getting that cultural shift. And a lot of it was determined by what people were we bringing on board and how were they aligned to the culture to help drive that change.
Right. So congratulations on your success, by the way, going from 6 employees to 50 employees in just a small number of years. Do you have a favorite story that you can think of and relate for us that, from the culture or from the use of the core values at work?
Gosh, I don't know if there's a favorite story, but I think, one thing that always sticks out for me is having grown up and observed this company from afar, because my grandpa was running it. And to no judgment for how he drove the organization. He was intelligent and successful, and he built a company and a culture that was consistent and aligned to him. But what I did observe was that it was very hierarchical, and not everyone had equal seats and voices at the table, which is one of our values underneath people first.
That's right.
And it was negative. And I think seeing what it was like, and a lot of people saying, well, that's just how Matrix is. That's just what it is. It's been really refreshing to be able to see with thought and practice and intention that you can shift an organization and have it be a very different energy and dynamic and culture inside it. And we hear from anyone who comes now in the 4 walls that this house is definitely running very differently than it was, and you can feel the energy shift. And I think that's just all intentional in the design of a strategy and a culture and a space.
Yeah. And I've been in meetings myself where I've actually heard you say, listen, it's equal voices at the table, everybody speak up. And I know that's definitely a culture that you live by. So that's very cool that you would recite that example. Is there a piece of advice that you would share with our listeners from your experience managing culture in Matrix?
I think it's definitely been very interesting for me to look at how do you manage culture in a very traditional industry segment that's not defined by being like a tech company where there's ping pong tables and beer in the cafeteria and other things. And I guess I've shifted my point of view on this slightly over the years, which is I don't think there's any bad culture. I think that you can be a very traditional and conservative or hierarchical organization if that is aligned to the culture you want to create. And I think you could just as easily be a very flat, startup company, different energy, different mentality, and have a culture that's defined by that. And I think sometimes we get very judgy to suggest what is a good culture or a bad culture, but different things work for different people. And I think it's really figuring out how do you find an organization that is aligned with your thoughts and beliefs, and how do you want that culture to be played out on a day-to-day basis? And then how do you get people that are aligned to that? And if they're not aligned to it and it's not a good fit, that's okay too. and they can probably find another organization and another culture that is more aligned to them. And just like it doesn't make sense to keep someone in your organization that isn't a good cultural fit, I think it goes both ways. And so there's probably 100 ways to skin the cat on what good culture looks like and how it's defined and what adjectives do we use and what energy and what does the space look like. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you've really got to make it your own and whatever feels good about that. Yes,
quite agree. It's not something that you can judge or score or say, is it good or bad? But the point is, as you said, to make it your own. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much for being a part of Culture Czars CEO Culture Interviews. And it's great to learn about the culture matrix. And again, congratulations for what you've built there. And I look forward to following your progress as the company keeps growing and you keep keeping your culture alive so it thrives. And you clearly are using it to drive performance too at the company.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe, check us out on the web at cultureczars.com, and we'll see you next time.